Hi, welcome back. So now we're going to be talking about the second line of defense. This is the immune system, part 2 in our video lecture series on the immune system. So in the second line of defense, we have defensive cells. So we're going to be talking about a variety of different types of phagocytic cells. And then we're going to be talking about defensive proteins like your complement and your interferon proteins. And then we're going to be talking about inflammation, the inflammatory response, and then fever and the adaptive value of fever in our body's defense mechanisms. So we're right here on our concept map in the second line of defense. So these are nonspecific internal, cellular, and chemical defenses. So the white blood cells that are our phagocytic cells are an important part of our second line of defense. So these are white blood cells that have this amazing ability to be able to do phagocytosis. So they can reach out extensions of their plasma membrane, wrap around an invading pathogen like a bacteria cell, and bring that bacteria cell into the inside of the white blood cell and digest it. Some of these cells are also antigen presenting cells, and we're going to be talking more about these antigen presenting cells when we cover the third part of the immune system, which is the adaptive immune response. So we have a variety of different types of phagocytic cells. The neutrophils are basically like the first responders of our body. So the neutrophils come from the bone marrow because they respond to these chemicals coming from damaged or inflamed tissues. They are in the bloodstream, and they are also just naturally kind of floating around in our bloodstream, and they can respond to this infection within the first hour that our body is encountering that particular type of pathogen. So they are the first responders. They start to identify and clean up cells, kind of engulfing them, the pathogen that is. They start to eat that pathogen up. They are still a part of our non-specific immune response though. So they're not identifying specific pathogens at this point. They come to the area that is inflamed and they start dealing with eating up bacteria. The macrophages are another type of phagocytic cell, and the macrophages develop from a cell called a monocyte. So monocytes are naturally floating around too in our circulatory system, and when they're called to the area that is inflamed by the signaling molecules that we're going to be talking about in a little bit, called kinins, they're called to the area through those signaling molecules that the tissue cells would be giving off that are having the problem, that are encountering the invader. So within about 12 hours, the monocytes can differentiate into macrophages. And macrophages are a very large kind of white blood cell with huge appetites. So when the neutrophils have been the first responders, taken care of the first part of the infection, the macrophages can take over, and they're kind of that other wave of battle defenses. They're like the reinforcements. So they start fighting that infection and start engulfing and doing away with the bacteria. And then we have the eosinophils. The eosinophils are a specialized type of phagocytic cell, white blood cell, that is able to attack the pathogens that are relatively large, too large for phagocytosis. So they can attack parasitic worms that would occur potentially in our blood. So this is a chart showing you many of these different kinds of white blood cells. You can see there's a variety of different kinds of white blood cells. And so the macrophage is a very large phagocytic white blood cell. It also is an antigen presenting cell, so it can present the pieces of protein, the antigen, on that bacteria cell's membrane on its self markers called MHC markers, and it can present those to the T cells, the helper T cells, and activate them. The macrophages also secrete the cytokines, which are signaling molecules in our immune system, and they circulate in the blood in that immature form called the monocyte. And then they're kind of the type of big, bulky white blood cell that gets to the infection site second after the neutrophil. The neutrophil is the first responder, so it's the fastest acting type of phagocyte that is naturally circulating in the blood all the time, and so it can arrive on site a little faster. All of these types of white blood cells that we're talking about here, both the phagocytic white blood cells and the lymphocytes, the B cells and T cells that we'll be talking about later on, they originate in the bone marrow. The bone marrow manufactures all of these cells of the blood. The eosinophil is a specialized type of white blood cell that's able to engulf larger types of pathogens like parasitic worms. They're also circulating in the blood just normally. So those white blood cells that don't circulate in the blood, they typically hang out in like the lymph nodes, so the lymphatic system and the spleen, the organs of the lymphatic system. So then we have the basophil and the mast cell. The mast cell and the basophil cell are types of white blood cells that contain granules of histamine, and histamine, of course, is involved too in the immune response. But histamine is in the immune response. What I was going to say is in the allergy response. But histamine is an important part of our immune system that once it's secreted, it gives the white blood cells the ability to leave the blood a little bit better. So it causes more fluid accumulation and it causes dilation of the blood vessels so that those white blood cells can exit the capillaries and get into the tissue spaces to deal with infection. The dendritic cell are a type of white blood cell, phagocyte cell, that hangs out in our tissues, and they're also antigen presenting cells. So the pathogens that they encounter in our tissue spaces, they would be dealing with those, and then what they do is they migrate to the lymph nodes and they can present that specific antigen that they got from the pathogen to the helper T cells to activate the other parts of the immune system, the adaptive immune response. So we'll be talking about that more in a bit here. So another type of defensive cell that we have in our nonspecific immune response or our innate defenses is the natural killer cell or NK cells. So this is also a type of white blood cell, but this type of white blood cell does not do phagocytosis. They kill in a little bit different way. They kill by secreting perforins and enzymes onto the cell membrane of a cell that would be identified as being abnormal. So cells that are invaded by viruses, oftentimes they are incapacitated, they're not displaying the appropriate MHC markers or self markers on them. So that's how the natural killer cell can identify them. Natural killer cells can also identify cancer cells because cancer cells, because of their damaged DNA, typically are not displaying the appropriate membrane-bound proteins as well. So then the natural killer cell can identify them and kill them. So They're a bit different, though, than the cytotoxic T cells that we'll talk about later on. Cytotoxic T cells and natural killer cells are two different kinds of cells. Natural killer cells would be more in our non-specific immune response, so they would kill more indiscriminately any kind of cell that they identified as being strange or not right in some way in our body. So a little bit more indiscriminate killing as far as the natural killer cells go. So the other types of cells in our immune system that are white blood cells are the lymphocytes. And we're going to be talking about B cells and T cells later on and their role in the adaptive immune response. But natural killer cells, also called cytotoxic cells, natural killer cells, kill by secreting these enzymes onto the cell membrane and causing those tissue cells of the body to die that have been infected by a certain pathogen. Okay, we also have these chemical weapons of immunity, so let's talk about those briefly. So there's a variety of types of chemical weapons that are used by our body to fight pathogens. And damaged cells, when they are infected, they release histamine and kinins. And these cytokines, there's a variety of different types of cytokines. Cytokines are generally cell-to-cell and cell-to-tissue signaling molecules that cells use to communicate. So when damaged cells release the histamine and the kinins, what happens is that causes blood vessels to dilate so that more of the white blood cells can get to the area that is inflamed. It causes capillary blood vessels to become more leaky to fluids so that more chemical signaling molecules can come to the area, more white blood cells are attracted to the area. White blood cells are actually made in the bone marrow, and they would be traveling in our blood vessels and trying to kind of sniff out, if you will, where the infections are taking place in our body. And so the signaling molecules serve this very important purpose of attracting the phagocytic cells, the white blood cells that are phagocytic, to the area that is inflamed and infected. Interferons specifically are a type of cytokine that we're going to be talking about here that are involved when we have a virus infection. So interferons are these small proteins that are secreted by a cell that's been infected by a virus. So what this type of protein does is attract the macrophages and natural killer cells to that area. It gives them the signal that something's going on here, you know, kind of little white flag, so that those types of white blood cells can come to the area and deal with that pathogen. The interferons also stimulate neighboring cells to make proteins that prevent the viruses from being able to replicate in those particular cells. The complement system is a large group of proteins, about 20 different blood plasma proteins that are naturally in our blood. And when activated, the complement system can do a variety of things, but one thing that it can do is form these attack complexes that allow the complement protein to be able to pop a bacteria cell directly. So the complement system destroys pathogens. It helps to call the blood cells, the white blood cells, to the area that is inflamed, and then it also helps to stimulate that inflammatory response. So these innate immune mechanisms that we've been talking about are a part of the non-specific immune systems that non-specifically eliminate pathogens that invade our internal tissues before they really become established, would be the hope of that. So these include the responses of the phagocytic cells, those macrophages and neutrophils that we've been discussing. It includes complement